Let me tell you a crazy story. This is William Friedkin. You may not have heard of him, but you've definitely heard of at least one of the movies he directed.
The Exorcist.
When it was released in 1973, The Exorcist became the source of a lot of controversy, and that's putting it lightly. Countless reports of audience members fainting in theaters and some highly publicized strange happenings occurring during and after the production gave The Exorcist a reputation for being a cursed film. Despite the outrage and strife it sparked, or more likely because of it, The Exorcist became Warner Brothers' highest-grossing film ever, and one of the most well-known and recognizable films of all time. And to honor that legacy, Blumhouse is apparently rebooting The Exorcist into a brand new sequel trilogy, which really makes me wanna. To say that The Exorcist is a disturbing movie is a waste of breath. But surprisingly, the scene that burrows the deepest under the skin of many viewers has nothing at all to do with demonic possession or unspeakable acts with a crucifix. It's this brutally realistic scene of a young Reagan being subjected to an excruciating medical procedure. This now less invasive procedure is called a cerebral angiography, and is where our story begins. As ghastly as the procedure looks, it's not nearly the most disturbing aspect of the scene. The year is 1972. Fresh off his Oscar wins for The French Connection, young hotshot director William Friedkin has settled on his new picture, an adaptation of the smash novel by William Peter Blatty, The Exorcist. Since a major theme of The Exorcist is the failure of Western medicine in healing and even in diagnosing Reagan McNeil, Friedkin scouts several hospitals in New York City, searching for something cinematic to put in his horror film. He found it during a visit to the NYU Medical Center. Dr. Barton Lane was there performing an angiography, and Friedkin witnessed the gush of blood that spurts from a patient's neck before a catheter is inserted into the punctured carotid artery. His intuition tugged at him. Friedkin immediately recruited Dr. Lane and his team to recreate the scene for the movie, and even went as far as to insist that they appear in the scene as extras. One member of Lane's team was a man named Paul Bateson, a radiology technician who was well liked by his colleagues for his outwardly friendly demeanor and pleasant bedside manner. Dr. Lane would later recall that, professionally, Bateson was, quote, the most experienced, and he was the best. He taught me a lot, and I considered him a good friend. Bateson made an immediate impression on William Friedkin.
I don't even remember the neurosurgeon's name now, but I remember the young man whose name was Paul Bateson. He was a really nice young guy. I remember that he wore a leather-studded bracelet, and he had an earring. I noticed that, just in passing, because you didn't see that in the workplace at that time.
Paul Bateson was born on August 24th, 1940, in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. The little knowledge we have of his childhood suggests that he suffered through a troubled relationship with his father. Bateson later admitted that he saw his contribution to The Exorcist as a kind of belated revenge on his father, who would often punish him by forcing him to stay home and listen to the opera on the radio when the Saturday matinees were playing nearby. Bateson spent the early part of the 1960s stationed in Germany with the army. It was during this time that Bateson first embraced alcohol, the only way to cope with the insurmountable boredom of his service. If excitement is what Bateson sought, he found it when he moved to New York City in 1964. Despite later asserting that he was not exclusively gay, Bateson would begin a relationship with a man, a 9-year relationship Bateson referred to as the days of wine and roses. Roses seemed to imply that this period was a blissful one for Bateson, and that he shared a genuine connection with his partner. The emphasis, however, is placed on wine, as countless cocktail and dinner parties cultivate his escalating dependence on alcohol. It's also during this time that Bateson's mother dies of a stroke, and his younger brother fatally wounds himself. The relationship ends in 1973, shortly before the release of The Exorcist. Now living alone and feeling adrift in his solitude, Paul Bateson freefalls into a permanent alcoholic stupor. Alcohol provided Paul with temporary solace, but incapacitated his work and social life, along with his nervous system. It wasn't long before he was fired from NYU and spending his nights passed out on his couch. Nobody likes a drunk, Paul would later recall. Alcohol consumed him, but it couldn't keep the void full for long. He craved companionship. I concentrated on trying to meet somebody I could get involved with, Paul recounted. Paul began venturing out into the night, cruising through the increasingly dangerous world of Manhattan's SM leather bars.
The winner is William Friedkin.
This is a tremendous honor, and I'm very proud to accept it. Most of all, I would like to thank the man who made it all possible. I owe it all to him. His name is Phil D'Antoni. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
After the roaring success of The Exorcist, William Friedkin needed a new project to apply his genius towards. Being an Oscar winner and at the height of his cinematic powers, he had no shortage of options. Friedkin's producer Phil D'Antoni approached him with an idea to adapt the 1970 novel Cruising into his next film. The novel follows an NYPD cop who goes undercover to catch a serial killer stalking New York's gay bars. The novel was inspired by true events. From the time the novel was conceived and well into the 1970s, the murders of gay men and their alarming frequency were not taken seriously by law enforcement and were heavily underreported by the media. That began to change when Village Voice journalist Arthur Bell started reporting on the string of unsolved murders occurring in the new world that Paul Bateson found himself exploring. The victims of these murders were found dismembered in garbage bags that had been tossed into the Hudson River. The murders were creatively coined the Bag Murders. Despite being somewhat intrigued by Cruising and Arthur Bell's reporting, William Friedkin decided to pass on the project. He instead directed the 1977 film Sorcerer, a movie I think is an underlooked masterpiece. Meanwhile, after a few attempts at sobriety, Paul Bateson began to slip further into the death grip of alcoholism. Drinking a minimum of a quart of vodka per day, his clear elixir often deprived him of the energy needed to go out and meet new people. His drinking also deprived him of his ability to perform with his partners. But I look for more than the physical, Bateson would say. I search for complete companionship. The idea of being a sex object is not my scene. In search of complete companionship, he staggered out of his apartment one fateful night and wound up at a leather bar called Badlands on Christopher Street. There, a man named Addison Verrill offered to buy Bateson a beer. Bateson's life would never be the same. One beer led to another, and soon drugs accompanied the drinks. They left Badlands and went to a bar called the Mine Shaft, where Verrill was something of a local celebrity. I didn't realize he was such a superstar, Bateson would later reminisce. Several hours later, the two went back to Verrill's apartment, where their binge continued into the early hours of the morning. As their time together came to a close, it became apparent to Bateson that this night was as far as Verrill intended to take their relationship. I wanted a lasting thing, Bateson said. I hated the rejection. It was the rejection that triggered things. Something flared up in my head. I decided to do something I'd never done before. The next day, the police found Addison Verrill dead in his apartment with severe trauma to the head and stab wounds in his chest. Greatly disturbed by the murder of his friend, variety film critic Addison Verrill, and frustrated by the police's characteristic lack of diligence in the investigation, Arthur Bell decides to take action. He took to the Village Voice to express that frustration in a scathing article. "We're all aware that there are psychopaths roaming the New York streets," Bell wrote, "and they don't advertise their intentions on their t-shirts." 8 days later, Bell received a phone call from someone claiming to be Verrill's killer. "Look," he said, "I like your story, and I like your writing, but I'm not a psychopath." The caller wouldn't give Bell his name, but, likely inebriated, he offered reams of irrelevant information. His father was an orchestra leader, and he had a wife and 14-year-old son in Berlin. They couldn't understand him or his sexuality. The caller repeatedly expressed his wish to atone for the murder, but when coaxed by Bell into revealing his identity, he still refused because he wouldn't be able to, quote, practice, and he'd lose his license. "Practice what?" Arthur asked. Bell wouldn't get his answer until the next evening when he received another call. This caller was a different person. "I know who killed Addison Verrill," he said. The anonymous caller identified the killer as an unemployed X-ray technician named Paul Bateson. "He phoned me the morning after the murder," the caller recounted. "He had to share his experience with somebody. I was the only person he could relate to." After losing his job at NYU, Paul briefly worked at an adult film theater. Bell later interviewed one of his former co-workers, who told him, quote, "I like Paul. I know him, and I know exactly why he called you. When Paul did something wrong, he'd have to go over to the school teacher and have his hand slapped. He was into punishment and non-punishment." Bell and his anonymous caller contacted the police, and when they showed up at Bateson's apartment, they found him dead drunk, sprawled out on the couch. Lying on the floor was a copy of the Village Voice, opened to Arthur Bell's article. Bateson told the police he knew why they were there. Still talkative in his stupor, he made an official confession to the murder of Addison Verrill and gave them Verrill's passport and credit card, which he'd stolen after the murder. Every detail of his confession matched what he told Bell over the phone. Bateson was charged with second-degree murder and was held at Rikers Island while awaiting trial. Bateson told Bell, "I might have talked too much." When the journalist paid him a visit in prison, Bateson declared confidently that he'd be exonerated. "I'll be judged not guilty," he said. "Then I'll tear up my roots and settle somewhere else, and try to grow new roots." Once Bateson's trial began, his road to exoneration became longer and bumpier. The prosecution attempted to pin the infamous bag murders onto Bateson. William Hoyt, the chief prosecutor, scrounged up a supposed confession that Bateson made to a friend named Richard Ryan. According to the prosecutor, Bateson told Ryan that, quote, "Killing is easy, that getting rid of the bodies is the hard part." He said that he cut up his victims and put the parts in plastic garbage bags to dispose of them. Arthur Bell's subsequent articles about Paul Bateson had a wide reach and finally brought attention to the scourge of murder plaguing Manhattan's gay community. Many who knew Bateson, including his own colleagues at NYU, were shocked and appalled by the news. One man, in particular, was so stunned that he decided he needed to visit Paul immediately to get to the truth of the matter. That man was William Friedkin. In the director's own words,
After the film had been in release, I see the front page of the New York Post, and he's accused of 5 or 6 murders. Murders in the S&M bars. And I look at this picture and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is the guy from NYU Medical Center. And I called his lawyer and I told him who I was, and I said, "You think I could visit with Paul? I was just curious. How could this guy have done these murders? And I went down to see him at Rikers Island, and I get into his cell. And he was very cheerful. Hi, how you do? How's the film doing? He says to me. I said, Paul, did you kill these people? I remember killing this one guy. I picked this guy up at the mine shaft, and I took him home, and then I cut him up, and I threw him in the East River. At the very bottom of the plastic bag, it said, property of NYU Medical Center, Neuropsychiatric Division. And he said, that's the only one I remember. He said, but they want me to confess to another 5 or 6. Because if I confess to 6 or 7 of these, they'll lower my sentence. I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm thinking about it.
Friedkin's brief reunion with Paul Bateson came at a time when the director was seeking a new project to devote his efforts toward. Entering Rikers Island, feeling professionally adrift, when Friedkin left the prison, he had definitively decided what his next film would be. The next year, Friedkin's film Cruising, starring Al Pacino, was released. Doubtlessly inspired by his meeting with Bateson, several tweaks to the story were made to mirror the events and the mystery of the Bag murders. The production of Cruising was highly controversial and severely troubled by organized protests from New York's gay community. Writing for The Village Voice, Arthur Bell anticipated Cruising to be, quote, the most oppressive, ugly, bigoted look at homosexuality ever presented on the screen. Cruising received mixed reviews when it was released, but in recent years has begun to cultivate a cult classic status. Despite the testimony from Richard Ryan, William Friedkin's account, and the alleged NYU print on the bottom of the death bags, Paul Bateson was never charged with the Bag murders. To this day, those murders remain unsolved. We will likely never know if Paul Bateson was the true killer or if his connections to the murders were fabricated in a Hollywood backlot of the mind. Paul Bateson would, however, be sentenced to a minimum of 20 years for the murder of Addison Verrill. According to public records, Bateson was released from prison in August of 2003, a day after his 63rd birthday. A record from the Social Security Death Index shows that Bateson passed away on September 15, 2012. Whether this is definitively accurate is not known, and as of the recording of this video, all attempts to locate Bateson have been unsuccessful. Speaking about Bateson after his sentencing, his colleague and Exorcist co-star Dr. Barton Lane said, quote, when you do radiology, even though there's a radiologist, you also have a very important support team, and I couldn't have done it without Paul. He was really excellent. I didn't realize until many years later that he had killed a man. I thought it was bizarre. I just had no idea.